Hello, it's been about a year now since the Russia-Ukraine war began, and this series of podcasts that we're doing will take stock of what's happened in a much more layered and historical perspective than what we currently see on display in the mainstream. So there have been many sort of wars in the recent past. We can think of Iraq, and if we go back a little further, we can think of the first Gulf War and Vietnam and so forth. And generally speaking, in the Western societies as well as around the world, there seems to be at least a degree of opposition. Let's say two sides to the coin. But it's rather unique that in this particular conflict, we have a situation wherein the opinion about the war seems to be rather almost completely unanimous. The narrative seems to be pretty much well set. There is a sort of David and Goliath situation. There is this enormous sort of monster which is sort of coming into this small nation that's hanging on to democracy by the skin of its teeth, and the rest of the sort of noble European powers are helping this tiny little David resist this Russian juggernaut. Apart from a few sort of few well-known names such as John Mearsheimer, Noam Chomsky, the opinion seems to be that this is an unjust sort of war, and that any sort of moral response has to be against it. Well, this might be the case. We don't deny it or we don't accept it in one way or the other. But what we feel is that the story that's told around the war is completely insufficient. No great historical event happens or occurs because of one evil genius controlling the strings behind the scenes. Historical events are often complex and layered situations where it's very murky to sort of weed out the elements of right and wrong. And that the premise of this podcast basically is that the morality of an event or an action cannot be judged in classrooms based on abstract principles, but rather by sort of wading into those reeds, looking through the historical and social, political and economic context, and then coming to a much more nuanced understanding of a situation. So therefore, what we're going to stay away from in this podcast is offering moral opinions, offering narratives that we feel that our viewers must take, but rather sort of just looking at the situation and trying to bring out certain elements that have largely been ignored in the mainstream's presentation of the issue. And while there might be a certain focus on one set of events or one set of historical factors, this doesn't necessarily imply that another set of historical factors on the other side of the issue didn't happen, but only that those issues and those factors are getting so much attention that we feel it's not necessary to focus on them at the moment. So to discuss these issues, namely the sort of origin, the source, the conflict, and the let's say the perceived and actual interests behind the conflict, we have with us today somebody who, in my view, is a really great expert on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. His name is Dr. Julien Paret. He's a versatile scholar with a cross-disciplinary outlook, and he's specialized in Russian and Eurasian affairs. He received his PhD in post-Soviet studies, language, cultures, and politics from Paris Sorbonne and National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilizations. Dr. Paret is primarily involved in research on Russian and Eurasian politics. His work lies at the intersection of history, philosophy, and international relations. He's especially interested in Russia's pivot to the Asia-Pacific region, as well as in Russia's approach to the information warfare. He's well versed in Soviet and post-Soviet subcultures and political margins. And over the past few years, he's spent almost a decade in Russia and the surrounding Eurasian regions. So welcome, Dr. Paret, to this podcast.
Thank you very much for this very flattering introduction, Dr. Anirudh.
Absolutely.
I'm very happy to be with you to discuss Russia-Ukraine war today.
Thank you. So I thought we'll begin with the starting point that's generally a very useful one. Of course, we can go back hundreds of years, but I think a great place to begin talking about this is the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was, of course, a very turbulent and a sort of difficult and intervolved affair. So we might argue that the current Russia-Ukraine conflict finds its roots in the fall of the Soviet Union. And especially the sort of redrawing of boundaries after 1991. So could you just explain to us how this sort of really tangled history played out at the time?
Yes, that's definitely true. I would like to point out first that this is important to understand that the collapse of the USSR didn't only mark the end of Soviet communism, but also the end of nearly 400 years of Russian imperialism, Russian colonialism in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and even in the Far East of the Asian continent. It is with good reason, that the current Russian President, Vladimir Putin, once said that on this subject, in his opinion, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was probably the greatest geopolitical disaster catastrophe of the 20th century. We must remember that, the USSR was not a homogeneous political body, I would say, unlike the European nation states of the 19th century. The USSR was a transcontinental country spanning a large part of the Eurasian continent. It was a multinational empire. It was more than a country. It was really an empire. And the USSR was composed of 15 European and Asian republics whose both politics and economics were highly centralized, with Russia as its head and Moscow as its heart, I would say. So Russian as people and Russian as a language and a culture were subduing Eurasia for many centuries, for more than 400 years. And suddenly, I need to imagine from one day to the next, after the breakup of the USSR, millions of them who were Russian nationals with Soviet passport, living inside the Union but outside of the Russian Soviet Republic. They had to decide to relocate overnight and leaving everything behind, or to adopt the citizenship of their newly formed country. And it was an absolute tragedy for millions of families all across the Soviet Union. To give you an example of the fatal consequences, I would say, of a new drawing of these borders that are still relevant today, I would like to drag your attention to the cases of Estonia and Latvia, two Baltic countries, which used to be part of the Soviet Union and are now part of member state of NATO and of the European Union also. And after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, you have to know that the access to the citizenship of these countries has been restricted to the Russians and their offspring who settled in these countries only after they joined the USSR in 1944. So today, even if 40 years after the dissolution of the USSR, you still have around 25% of the population in these countries, in Estonia and in Latvia, who are Russian, ethnically, culturally Russian, but they are still deprived, I would say, of their elementary democratic rights. They are considered as second-zone citizens. And they are openly discriminated with a tacit consent of NATO and the European Union. We must be aware, I would say, that since the ethnic groups and the different culture of the Soviet Union were all mixed or distributed, in different regions of the country for several generations already. So as the USSR began to collapse, the social disintegration and the political instability of a declining union fostered a surge in ethnic uprising and in border conflicts also. And it creates an upsurge in nationalism, I would say. And this upsurge has fueled violent disputes over territorial boundaries between the newly established state which needed, to try to justify their existence and to try to create from scratch a new identity. So there is, to start, the well-known example of the two wars of Nagorno-Karabakh in the South Caucasus. It is an Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan, which is disputed for centuries already between the Armenian Orthodox Christian and the Muslim Turks that we know now they call Azeri, but They used to be called Turks before the creation of the Soviet Union. We have to realize that under communism, in the time of the USSR, Armenia and Azerbaijan were parts of the same country. We were part of the Soviet Union. So it was not an issue that the Nagorno-Karabakh was belonging officially to Azerbaijan, even if it was populated by Christian Armenians. But since at the end of the USSR, since it was not anymore Soviet rule in fine, which was running this population, ethnic trouble started to break out at the end of the 80s, and no the Soviet government, no the Soviet army were able to stop the riots, and they escalated gradually into an armed conflict, with the first war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the first war of Nagorno-Karabakh between 1988 and 1984, that resulted with the creation of a breakaway state of Artsakh in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the second war, which took place in 2020, when Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, could retake over the territories that Azerbaijan had lost during the first war. In the same region of South Caucasus, to give you another example, we have on the Black Sea coast the case of the frozen conflicts of Georgia, because between 1991 and 1993 there was a very bloody civil war in Georgia, and when the small republics of Abkhazia and Ossetia and South Ossetia, backed by Russia, they both were supported by Russia, seceded from Tbilisi, from the capital of Georgia. And if you remember, 10 years later, in 2008, under the presidency of Mikhail Saakashvili, a pro-European, pro-American Georgian president, there was a short war between Russia and Georgia. After Georgia tried to take over these lost territories, once again, 10 years after the war. I could also mention the civil war in Tajikistan, in the heart of Central Asia, from 1992 to 1997. But I would say that the case which is probably the closest to a situation between Russia and Ukraine, in my opinion, is the Transnistria war in the former Moldovan Soviet Republic, from 1990 to 1992. In Moldova, you had a short conflict between pro-Russian forces of Transnistria, including nationalist militia, pro-Russian militias, and some unofficial elements of the Russian army who were backing them, and pro-Moldavian forces who were backed by Romania. At this time, Romania was not a part yet of the European Union, nor the NATO. Moldova, today we say Moldova, but before it was Moldavia under the Soviet era. It is a small state which is located at the border of Romania and Ukraine, and Transnistria represents slightly more than 1/10 of Moldova territory. It is a narrow land of a narrow band of land which is located near the southwest of Ukraine. And on the eve of Soviet Union's breakup, Moldovan national elements showed increasingly hostile sentiment against the Russian minority, and they expressed their intent to leave the USSR in favor of maybe uniting with Romania in the future. For example, they imposed, among others, the use of Moldovan as an official language, and they have also imposed the use of Latin alphabet instead of the old Cyrillic alphabet, which was used before in Moldova. And this change, they led the Russian-speaking population, the Russian-speaking minority of Moldova, believe that a union, a reunification between Moldova and Romania was inevitable. And the Russian-speaking minority, I would say, started, to feel that it was time for them to find a way to stop these changes, or if no, they might be excluded from the political space, and maybe probably simply exterminated. That was also a possibility. So the Russian minority revolted against the Moldovan majority, with the support of the Russian 14th Army, and which was based at this time in Transnistria, and the conflict resulted in the creation of a breakaway state, the breakaway state of Transnistria. So this is why I would say that the case between Transnistria and Donbass is close enough in the, I would say, in the global picture. And I would like you to remember, to keep in mind that as a result, you won't be surprised to know that the former Soviet republics, which had targeted the Russian minority, Russian-speaking speaking minority and challenge, I would say, the leadership of Russia in its natural sphere of interest, I would say, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, such as the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, or later Romania, which is a former Soviet satellite, even if it wasn't a member state of the Soviet Union. They all joined NATO and the European Union in the next decade. So we could also mention the case of Georgia, because Georgia, even if Georgia is not a member state of NATO officially, it is an aspirant country since 2011, and same with Ukraine. Ukraine was one of the country in which the Russian majority suffered the most, especially after the Maidan revolution of 2014. And same case, Ukraine then became an aspirant country to join NATO, and now we might say that Ukraine is de facto a state of NATO.
Thank you so much for that really broad canvas of conflicts that was sort of fomented or even triggered by the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's remarkable how a sort of a kind of structure of power can keep so many different, boiling, brooding conflicts at bay just by the fact that there isn't a border drawn between them. You mentioned towards the end of your answer that there was, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there are many states that are now being sort of absorbed into the sphere of NATO. This can be officially, as in some of the cases where they officially become members of NATO, members of the European Union, or there are unofficial ways in which NATO, the NATO alliance, establishes its sphere of influence within these states. And of course, when this happens, there are parts of the country which are riven ethnically, religiously, politically, that favor this, let's say, foray into NATO, and others that maybe don't want it. Could you, and of course, some might argue that it's up to the country as to, whether they want to be in NATO or not. But largely speaking, we can settle on one proposition that Russia has a problem with, more and more countries in its border joining the NATO alliance. Could you tell us what the main problem that Russia has with NATO's eastward expansion towards Russia, and also, corollary to that, what is Russia's problem with what is often characterized as humanitarian interventions in the region?
Well, I would say that to understand why Russia considers the expansion of NATO as a threat, why Russia perceived it as a threat, it is important to understand what NATO is, and why it was created, and why it has not been dismantled, I would say, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. NATO is a US-led transatlantic military alliance which was established in 1949 in the aftermath of the Second World War, and with the aim of ensuring, I would say, the security of Western Europe and Northern America, and prevent direct nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. And during the Cold War, NATO was operating as a check against the perceived threat which was posed by the Soviet Union, obviously. And for more than 40 years, I would say that NATO helped to maintain the balance of power in the world. And NATO contained the expansion of Soviet communism, for example. So from the foregoing, I would say that it is indisputable, in my opinion, that the existence of NATO was perfectly legitimate from 1949 to 1991. Because the Soviet Union was posing a threat to the security of liberal democracies, I would say, and even beyond. Because after the collapse of the USSR, the dissolution of the Soviet Union raised new international questions, new geopolitical issues. For example, the proliferation of mass destruction weapons, the proliferation of nuclear warheads. So NATO had an important role to play in the global security, I would say. The problem is that at the end of the 80s, when the Soviet Union was about to collapse, while the US President George H. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, and the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev were negotiating the Soviet transition from communism to liberalism and capitalism, it had been agreed between their development, at least from the Soviet side, I would say, that the USSR was opposed to the reunification of Germany and to the integration of a reunified Germany to NATO, but the European Union and
Could
NATO...
I just interrupt you for a moment? Could you tell our listeners a little bit about the situation in Germany, just briefly?
Yes, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The wall, which was divided Berlin into the Soviet and the Western camps, I would say. In the aftermath of the fall of Berlin, the process of reunification of Western and Eastern Germany started. And 1 year later, in 1990, officially Germany has been reunified and became once again a country, a unified country.
One unified country. Okay, please go ahead. Sorry.
We have to remember that at this time, Eastern Germany was under Soviet influence. It was a communist regime, and to accept the reunification of Germany, the US had to convince Gorbachev and the Soviet that they will give them something in exchange. They won't accept against anything in return the reunification of Germany. So during the negotiation, there was this agreement between American and Soviet that okay, we are going to let you reunify Germany, but in exchange you are going to stop the expansion eastward of NATO, and maybe in the future later you will start thinking of opening the road to the integration of Russia. Why not in NATO, or why not dismantling NATO? Because NATO was created to stop the expansion of communism, and with the end of communism, NATO didn't really have any purpose of existence, I would say. But the fact is, although the Berlin Wall fell, although Germany was reunified, NATO is still here at the end, and NATO resumed its expansion process just a few years after the collapse of the USSR. And I would say that NATO didn't only pursue its expansion; it pursued expansion near the borders of the Russian Federation, of a newly established Russian state on the ashes of the Soviet Union. Integrating more and more former Soviet satellites, such as Poland in 1999, and later, since 2004, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania also. And I would say that the appetite coming with eating, the enlargement, the process of enlargement even never stopped, because Georgia is an aspiring country to integration to NATO. Ukraine is de facto a member state of NATO now. It was the words of Ministry of Ukraine and Ministry of Defense himself 2 months ago. So, moreover, we have to keep in mind, I would say, that in the same period when Poland joined NATO, and just a few years later, the Baltic states also joined NATO, Ukraine and Georgia, these two former Soviet republics, also located at the border periphery of the Russian Federation, both with strategic access to the Black Sea, which is very important to mention it, started to develop very close ties, with NATO. Because when you become an aspiring, I would say, member state of NATO, you have to get adapt to the NATO protocols. You have to change the training formation of your soldiers, and so on. You have to change your material also. Just in the aftermath of the so-called wave of counter-revolution, when pro-US and pro-European governments came into power in Georgia and in Ukraine, as a result, probably to win the favors of Washington and Brussels at this time, we have to remember that Ukraine and Georgia sent some soldiers to participate in the global war of the George Bush, famous George Bush global war on terror, to fight in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Just a few hundred soldiers, but it was a symbolic action to show the goodwill of these countries to get closer to NATO, and to show that to show the Americans that they have a future in the NATO alliance. And just to give you an example to let our audience understand, to give them a clear picture of what it means for Russian, from a Russian perspective, is toward NATO's expansion. It is a bit as if, let's take the example of American continent, and let's say, imagine that Russia has concluded some military alliance with most of the Latin American countries, with most of the Central American countries, South American countries, with Canada, and that Canada has also deployed some soldiers, during the current Russia-Ukraine war to fight along with Russian soldiers. It would be exactly the same. From a Russian perspective, they are surrounded by NATO member states, and they feel threatened. They feel targeted, and they have good reason to be targeted because there are obviously missiles which are targeting Russian cities and Russian military bases on Russian soils. In the same vein, I would like to add also to mention it is important to make a bit of history and to remember also the critical role, I would say, of NATO in the dismantling and the breakup of Yugoslavia during the 90s, because Yugoslavia was I would say the last nationalist and socialist state of Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and NATO played a critical role in the dismantlement of not only Yugoslavia but also of the head of Yugoslavia, Serbia, because Serbia has lost Kosovo, has lost also Montenegro, and you all remember, I guess, the carpet bombing campaign of NATO against Serbia in 1999, with the creation of a progressive state later of Kosovo and Montenegro. And it is at this stage, I would say, that the Russian government, less than 10 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, realized that actually what happened with Yugoslavia might someday, and happened before with the Soviet Union, might someday happen also to the Russian Federation itself. The dismantlement not only of the Soviet Union, not only of the Yugoslavia, but also the dismantlement of Russia to take over the natural resource of the Russian Federation and impose Western liberal and so-called democratic views on their politics. And it is at this point, I would say, that Boris Yeltsin, who is very fairly, I would say, criticized in Russia and now because of the policy, of the pro-Western policy that he was leading in the 90s. But he had this, I would say, he woke up in the 90s and he realized suddenly that maybe the US and the European Union went too far in humiliating Russia and the Russian people. And in one, I would say, of his rare sober moments, he decided to change the narrative. And it is at this moment that he has first appointed as Prime Minister Primakov, Evgeny Primakov, who was one of the first architects, I would say, of a return of Russia on the global stage, and then obviously Vladimir Putin, who became a few months later the next president of the Russian Federation. So the fact is that in the 90s, I would say that from a Russian perspective, the European Union and the US took a huge advantage of the very harmful consequences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and also the difficult transition for the Russian population and from in all the newly from a country to globalization, democratization, neoliberalization, also I would say, marketization of the society. And the US, they advanced their strategic interest to Russia and to Russia's natural sphere of influence, I would say, without any regard for Moscow's perception of their expansion. They just pushed their pawns further and further, even directly threatening the stability of the Russian Federation itself, as I was explaining before. Because we must also remember that in the 90s, Russia was also on the verge of collapse. You had civil war in Chechnya. You had a secessionist movement in Tatarstan also, and it is not, also in Siberia, it is not by chance, I would say, that at this time in the 90s, the secessionist leaders in Tatarstan and in Chechnya, like Alan Maskhadov, they were calling for the enlargement of NATO to Chechnya or to Tatarstan. They were claiming that someday they could also join NATO.
That's a fantastic summary of the situation with NATO. I want to draw our audience to two analogies and ask you to enlarge on one of them slightly. The first analogy is, rejecting the right of Russia to be, let's say, to feel threatened by the establishment of NATO forces and weapons and the NATO extraction of materials and reconfiguration of local societies on the very verge or border of Russia, the sort of rejecting the right of Russia to be genuinely threatened by this and thereby resist it by any means necessary, would be like, Julien said, would be like rejecting the right of America or the USA to not be threatened by the establishment of Russian weapons, Russian missiles facing Washington D.C. Plonked in Mexico City or in Toronto. Right, so that's the essential analogy that we're often, missing. It would, we might even go further and say that, let's say, after the 1990s, the American Union was threatened, and that California, got independence as they wanted to in the 19th century. And it would be almost like saying that the Russian missiles would be, California would enter into an alliance with Russia, and Russian missiles would be placed in California facing DC. We would think it, relatively reasonable for, let's say, an American president to just not allow this, keeping in mind that, the American president in the 1960s actually did almost take the world to the verge of nuclear war because there were Russian missiles that were going to be placed all the way down in Cuba. So we sometimes forget these analogies. The second analogy is the one that I wanted you to briefly expand upon. This is the one you made between the NATO's involvement in Yugoslavia and why that involvement, just exactly why that involvement and the kind of thing they did to break up Yugoslavia was seen as a threat by analogy to what NATO might effect in Russia. Could you just expand?
The analogy with the former Yugoslavia is very good, I think, because Yugoslavia, we have to, first of all, to try to define what was the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia. It was the last socialist and nationalist state of Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was located in southern part of Europe, in the so-called Balkanic states. And same as Russia was, I would say, the center and the heart of the Soviet Union, Serbia was the center and the heart of Yugoslavia. And since the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, nationalist upsurge started to happen in Yugoslavia, fostered by the US and the European Union at this time already, because both had an interest in the collapse of Yugoslavia. I would say the US wanted to apply their neoliberal policies that they have already started to apply in South America with the infamous, I would say, General Pinochet in Chile, for example. And the newly reunified Germany wanted to create for its economic development some hinterland in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. And it was a very good opportunity for, I would say, the German market, for its development, to be able to hire well-trained specialists coming from former Yugoslavia. So they both had a big interest, both the European Union and NATO, in the disappearance, I would say, in the collapse of Yugoslavia. And at the same time, we have to remember that Serbia, the heart of Yugoslavia, was historically the close ally of Russia. Both are slave people, both are Orthodox Christian, and their language are not such different. And still now, even if Serbia is almost de facto, I would say, a member state of the European Union and NATO, because Serbia has been totally crushed in 1999 and in 2000 after the war against NATO, and since then is ruled by pro-European, pro-American elite. Still now in the population, I would say that Vladimir Putin is very popular, and people tend to have a very high opinion of the Russian Federation. So when Yugoslavia started to be dismantled, and later Serbia also started to be dismantled, first Russia was powerless because in the 90s Russia was enduring a huge economic crisis due to the transition to capitalism, and at the same time some, I would say, some Russian statesmen started to question their I would say, growing partnership with the US and the European Union. What if someday the Russian Federation also was itself dismantled, as it happened with Serbia? Because we have to remember that Serbia has lost the cradle of its civilization, Kosovo, and Serbia has also lost Montenegro, because after the war, first a new state has been created, Serbia and Montenegro, and then only Serbia remained, and Montenegro became I would say, a breakaway state. After, I would say that the Yugoslav and the Serbian example helped the Russian political class maybe to wake up from their dream of westernization, liberalization, democratization, and realize that maybe they have been lured into the belief that the war that Western powers were leading against the Soviet Union was not only a war against Soviet communism, it was a war against, I would say, the existence of a powerful Russia itself.
That's a great analogy, I think, because it provides a concrete instance of something that justifies a genuine fear about the NATO expansion. But we've been sort of, in some ways talking about, let's say, certain regions in Eastern Europe as maybe indirectly, psychologically, the events there as psychologically affecting Russia. We've also been talking about certain events there as politically and economically affecting Russia. But somebody who comes into international relations and politics and is relatively new to the field thinks of a nation state as an autonomous unit, and believes in something like, let's say, sovereignty, and that what happens outside of one's nation state, apart from the aspect of national security, should not be their concern. That Russia used to be an empire, as we began saying, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact that former Soviet states are, being seduced, at least elements in them are being seduced by, let's say, NATO or Western powers, is none of Russia's business. It's what happens with them. It doesn't matter to them. So there, I think I want to sort of expand this notion of, let's say, a boundary of a country as necessarily restricting concern. And start thinking of the world, let's say, in terms of spheres of influence. We've already used that phrase, Russia's sphere of influence. There's America's sphere of influence in Latin America, and of course, throughout the last century, pretty much all over the world. First of all, is it legitimate to think of a sphere of influence as something that's salient to international relations, or is it just some kind of hangover from colonial times that we should just not think about? Let's start with that.
I understand your question. That's definitely an excellent question. I would say that, first of all, in geopolitics, what we usually call sphere of influence is the claim by a state to predominate cultural, political, economic, or control in general, control over a foreign region. And historically, this concept dates back from the 19th century, when the European great powers were competing for control over Asia and Africa. So you were right to establish a comparison with colonialism, because the idea of sphere of influence is, I would say, closely related to the colonial experience. But just to give you an example of what, for me, a sphere of influence is, I would like to propose our audience to have a look at Central and South America, as you said, because since the establishment of the doctrine of the Monroe Doctrine in the beginning of the 19th century, these foreign areas are the hunting ground of, I would say, of a U.S. foreign policy, and where the U.S. bring up and down the political regime that there is, and we can mention the dark hours of the Condor operation, for example, or also the support of nationalist militia, of a contrast in Nicaragua.
Maybe just one line on what the Condor operation was.
Oh, the Condor operation was was an operation led by the CIA in the 70s to back some right-wing dictatorship, Latin American dictatorship in Uruguay, in Argentina, and in Colombia also, to officially to stop the expansion of communism, and unofficially to take over, I would say, the political control, economic control of these countries. And you had a lot of crimes which has been committed in these countries in the name of democracies and human rights. During the 70s, you have the famous case of desaparecidos in Spanish, the disappeared, the people who were disappearing suddenly one day to the next, and many families have been broken, people have been arrested because of their political views, an atmosphere of general mass surveillance and general suspicion, I would say, against the suspected socialist elements of the society. And one of the reasons why I would say the US could prevent the unification of the Latin American continent was doing the good old policy of divide and rule by supporting some right-wing dictatorship, which in return were chasing their own communists and trying to stop the expansion of communism. But later, it led to some very ironic cases, like in Nicaragua, for example, where first the USA were backing Noriega, and then they have changed his regime. And when I would say the military junta became obsolete after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Another very important, I would say, example of the US influence in Southern America is the case of Chile that we have mentioned earlier, because we have to remember that Salvador Allende was the first democratically elected socialist president in the history, and 3 years after his election in 1973, he has been chased from power, removed from power, after a coup which was backed by the CIA once again, when the infamous General Augusto Pinochet became the president of Chile, and applied the neoliberal policies of the Chicago Boys, because there was this agreement between Pinochet and the USA: we are going to sponsor your COP, and in exchange you are going to apply our economic reform. Sorry. The case, I would say that the case of Russia's sphere of influence is different. Why? First, when we raise the cases of Belarus, Ukraine, I would say the Slavic sisters of modern Russia, we can legitimately wonder if we are really talking about foreign countries, about foreign areas, because these states have been literally founded by the Russians, and their population have been culturally and linguistically Russian for centuries. Due to the legacy of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Obviously, I would say it doesn't mean that you don't have any national identity in Belarus or in Ukraine, or that people don't feel different, they don't feel that they are not exactly as Russians are. But we have to always to keep in mind that Belarusian identity, Ukrainian identity emerge in the margins of empires, in the, I would say, not by themselves, but in relation with the great powers of the time, in relation with the Russian Empire, with the Polish kingdom, with the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom also, and these identity have been formed, I would say, in relation with their neighbor and with their powerful neighbors. And to stay on the subject of Ukraine, I would like to drag the attention of the audience to the Russian linguistic, because it is important to know that what does Ukraine mean actually. And Ukraine, Ukraina in Russian literally means the border frontier, the border zone. And in Russian, you have to know that you can design the idea, the concept of borders in different way. You can say, for example, granitsa. Granitsa, it is the limit. It is, I would say, the physical limit, the concrete limit. You have also rubiež. Rubiež, it is I would say, some kind of how to say, a border which is not fully delimited yet, fully finished. And you have another important term, is Ukraina, and outskirts, we would say in English, outskirts, or the border frontier, we used to say in the time of the Far West, for example. And the Ukraina, it is a gray zone. the border frontier is a zone between the frontier and the no frontier, I would say. It is a place where the identity are very fluid. They are not institutionalized. They are not very, I would say, clearly established. And this is why, in Russian language, from the perspective of Russian language, Ukraine and especially Ukrainians are, I would say, a portmanteau word to design the population living in this western, I would say, border frontier. It doesn't design a nation, but a population. And once again, it doesn't mean, in my opinion, in my view, that there is no Ukrainian identity. I have been to Ukraine several times, and I can absolutely admit that there is a Ukrainian identity, as there is a Belarusian identity, as there is a Moldov identity in Central Russia, and so on. But this is very complicated, to try to define a Ukrainian identity without taking into account the fact that Ukrainians and Ukrainian culture is one component of the Russian civilization as a whole, I would say, because in the name itself, Ukrainian, you have this idea of a western border frontier of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, and so on. If I had to give an example, I would say, of Russia-Ukraine relations in another civilizational perspective, to try to give a bigger picture of the situation, I would say that it reminds me both the cases of the Kosovo-Serbia situation that we have already mentioned, but also the case of Argentina-Uruguay relations because Argentina and Uruguay are two distinct states, but actually they are the same nation, they are the same people. And Argentinians and Uruguayans, they are separated, they are divided for political reasons, but not for cultural or linguistic reasons. And the other distinctions I wanted to establish between Serbia-Kosovo situation and Russia-Ukraine situation is because Kosovo is the cradle of Serbian culture, same as Ukraine is the cradle of Russian civilization. It is complicated for Russian to imagine their civilization without Ukraine, same as for Serbians it is complicated to imagine Serbia without Kosovo. Like for French people, it is complicated to imagine France without Paris, without the region Ile-de-France, where France started, because it is from where France started. Same as Ukraine for Russia or Kosovo for Serbia. I would say that the case of the Baltic countries is very different because, as I said earlier, the Baltic countries came under Russian influence very late, at the end of the Second World War, because they have been integrated to the Soviet Union by Stalin in 1944, and historically I would say that they have been more under the German influence and the Scandinavian influence in general. I would say that in South Caucasus the situation is also very different, because Georgia and Armenia are both very ancient civilizations, which are as ancient as the ancient Greeks themselves. I would say that in Central Asia it is also something else, because as you know, none of the current, I would say, state of Central Asia used to exist before the creation of the Soviet Union. They have been created from scratch after the collapse of the USSR, because in Central Asia you had nomadic empires, you had emirates, you had hordes, but not not states as we understand in the modern sense of this term. However, I would say that to come back to the case of Russia's sphere of influence, we have to keep in mind that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's sphere of influence has been considerably reduced. Because now, for example, under Soviet time, Russia had a strong influence on its so-called satellites of Eastern and Central Europe, like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. But Russia has lost all these countries after the democratic revolution of the end of the 80s, and now Russia's influence, I would say, is reduced to the core Russian strategic interest in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It is what the Russian political science is usually designed as Blizhny Zarubezhye. It means the near abroad, Russia's near abroad. And this near abroad covers, I would say, mostly the post-Soviet states, but what really matters for Russia's geopolitics, it is what we call in Russian Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the Russian-speaking world. That is to say, the Russian civilization sphere, with countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. Obviously, maybe we can also include the northern part of Kazakhstan, because it is populated by Russian speakers and a majority of Russian ethnic natives. So I would say that from a Russian perspective, Russia's natural sphere of influence includes potentially from a post-Soviet states, but especially the country from the Russian-speaking, from the Ruski Mir, Ukraine, Belarus, and northern part of Kazakhstan. But when the Orange Revolution happened in 2004 in Ukraine, and Ukraine started, I would say, to step back first from Russia's sphere of influence, and then from Russia, I would say, civilizational sphere itself, by undermining the importance of Russian language, by criticizing the legacy of the Soviet Union, by forgetting the Russian roots of a Ukrainian contemporary nation. Then Russia perceived the expansion of NATO, the expansion of the European Union, indirect, because in 2004 Ukraine didn't join NATO or the European Union, but Ukraine started to be under the influence of the US and the European Union. Russia had the impression that its vital interests were in, I would say, were in a serious jeopardy, were in danger. It is exactly as it was perceived by the majority of the population at this time.
Thank you. Is it fair to summarize that there are borders to countries that are accidents of history and geopolitics, and there are also civilizations which are not accidents but products of long historical processes, cultures, languages, art, a society, and so on and so forth, and that while Russia sort of seeking, a sphere of influence might have certain imperialistic elements, like when it seeks to, let's say, if it seeks to, bring back into its fold certain countries that you mentioned, which are, relatively new to the Soviet sphere of influence, just because they happen to exist in the Soviet Union, that might be deemed, imperialistic, revanchist, or, we might use these kinds of words. But on the other hand, a civilization, the ancient Russian civilization, wanting to, caring about, the elements of Russian civilization, especially its people, in countries that happen by accident of geopolitics to be in other modern countries, is slightly more complicated and less imperial in nature, especially when we're looking at those people in let's say Ukraine, Belarus, or whatever it is, who are Russian in every possible way by their roots, especially if we look at it from their point of view. Is that a fair characterization?
Totally agree with your insight. I would say on your geopolitical insight on the problem of borders and the relations between small nations and I would say hungry empires who are always in expansion. I would say that the tragedy of Ukraine is probably the fact that it is located in the margins of empires, in the margin of the Russian Empire, in the margin also of because Ukraine was under Polish influence, under Polish-Lithuanian influence, especially in the western part of the country. And I think that in the contemporary world, it is very complicated for these small nations to find their space on the geopolitical stage, especially because I would say for the Ukrainian case, Ukraine is undoubtedly a nation. You have a Ukrainian people, you have a very strong Ukrainian cultural identity, especially now, but it has never really managed to become a state. I would say a totally independent state, because Ukraine was as a territory, and Ukrainian as a people were always under foreign domination, I would say. And it is complicated to create from scratch something that never existed before. If we take the example the Central Asian new republics, they have been established, I would say, on the base of kin, the base of a kinship, because as maybe our audience knows, Kazakh and Uzbek are very closely related. Kazakh, it means the free man, literally, in Old Turkish, in ancient Turkish language, and the Kazakh branch has broken away from the Uzbek, I would say, kinship once in their history, and create their own herd, their own horde, sorry, their own community. But in the case of the margins of former sedentary empires and not nomadic steppe people empires, it is very complicated to establish itself as a state in this condition, especially because we live, I would say, in the era of civilization states, like India, like China, like we could say the Euro-Atlantic world in general, of the Russian Federation. The powerful state of today are more than nation, they are civilization. And this is something which is hard sometimes to understand, especially in the Western world, for Westerners, that you can't talk about Russia as a nation, because Russian people, they don't see themselves as a nation. You can talk about Russia as an empire, for the Russian Federation as some kind of empire, but not as a nation I would say, on the European common understanding of this term, because Russia is not a nation state. Russians are just, ethnic Russian, I would say, are just a component among others of the Russian people. And it is important to know, to understand that in Russian you have two terms to define, I would say, Russian identity. You have Russian as I would say, as a civic identity on your passport, for example, and Russian as a nation, as an ethnic identity. It is not exactly the same, but Chechens are Russian, for example. They can be Muslim, they can speak their own language, they can have different habits, but they are Russians. And in the mindset of most of the Russians, it should be the same for Ukrainians also, because from their perspective, Ukrainians are part of the Russian civilization world. But it is not the same for Balts, for example. And very often, it is misunderstood in Europe, in the Western world, and people tend to believe that, okay, today Putin is trying to invade Ukraine, tomorrow it will be Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and the day after tomorrow Poland, and then why not maybe he will take over again Eastern Germany. Yeah. But that's an illusion, that's not true. And as you perfectly said, I would say that the main concern of the Russian government is to defend the interests of a Russian-speaking population, a Russian minority, of the Russians, people belonging to the Russian civilizational sphere, to the Ruski Mir, to the Russian world. And we have to remember that in Ukraine, more or less, at least before the war, now that's complicated to say, 25% of the population was Russian or composed of Russian speakers. And when you have such a strong minority in your country, you can only have big discrepancies between I would say, the Western and Central Ukrainians, who are very pro-Western now, and the Eastern Ukrainians, who have a different mindset, who have a different attitude, different character, different conception of the idea of collective nation, if you want. So it is complicated to establish a state on this basis, I would say.
Thank you so much for that answer. So I think it's safe to say that the sort of tapestry of post-Soviet world is a very complex one, where the concepts that are born of a certain sort of post-Westphalia Western understanding of how states ought to be organized just doesn't always necessarily sort of cross-apply, or let's say cross over in a very neat and clear way. The fact that Russians care about their civilization as much as they care about a particular border that was drawn, let's say, after the 1991, is something that needs to be kept in mind as a factor that is an important influencing element in this present conflict. That is not to say that necessarily, Julien has made this point many times, that the Ukrainians don't have a state or they don't have sovereignty or anything like that, or not necessarily even to say that there is a strong rationale behind one particular military sort of episode, but just to say that the perspective of the actors on the ground may not always, let's say, ally or align very easily with what we might learn in our, westernized political science classes. So I think with that, we'll bring to a close this first episode of this podcast. We've today explored the roots of the conflict, going back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've teased out certain, let's say, conceptual misunderstandings, sphere of influence, nation state, civilization, linguistic, cultural, these kinds of elements that are important to keep in mind. We've looked at the expansion of NATO, or the expanding sphere of influence of the American powers, American European powers into Russian land, Soviet, ex-Soviet land. We've looked at why this might be disconcerting, why this might, make Russians or the Russian government feel threatened. And we've also looked at what Russia's main interests are in the land. And I think this is a strong base from which we can proceed to more concrete events that happen throughout the last 2 decades in the next episode, which will lead us, hopefully, in a few episodes to today's conflict. Thank you, Dr. Julien, for your insights and your sort of vast breadth of sharing your breadth of knowledge with us on the subject. And thank you to the listeners.